Aryans? Well, the Aryans are actually one of the many tribes of a language group known as Indo-Europeans. And they are an ancient group that originated uh, um, in southern Russia, and then for many reasons that we can only postulate, they migrated from their area of origin between the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea, and some migrated over into Europe, Southern Europe, Central Europe also, Central Asia down into what we know as Iran today, and further down into India. And the group that makes their way into India are known as Aryans. And I'll look at sort of some of the etymologies and similarities of the names of these various tribes that all originated from one area. They move into the Indus River Valley, over the Hindu Kush, into the Indus River Valley, somewhere between 1500 and 1000 BCE. And if you remember back to the Indus River dates, I put on my PowerPoint that their date of the highest point of their civilization, so far as we can tell, dated between 2500 and 2000 BCE. Of course, that civilization predates that, and it postdates it by maybe a few centuries. Um, but they're definitely not at the height. They've probably completely abandoned their cities even, um, before the Aryans even make it onto the scene. Thus, when I mentioned the Aryan invasion theory at the end of last lecture as one of the possible reasons the Indus River Valley collapsed, that one of the reasons historians have debunked that theory is because we now know that people didn't even live in those cities anymore. They'd already probably completely crumbled into decay. And if the climate changed that significantly, or there was a natural disaster or whatever, because these places are now in the Punjab and in parts of the Thar Desert. I mean, if the process of this lush alluvial plain has turned into a more desert-like um, situation for many of the Indus River Valley settlements, by the time the Aryans got there, there was nothing there. I mean, it was not a productive place. If it was still productive, people would have stayed there. So this is how it gets buried over, millennia, and not discovered again until the 1920s. Um, but the Aryans move in, some 500 years after the decline, or maybe 300 years after the decline of the Indus River Valley, and they set up shop. Now, this trek over the mountains is no easy task. If it was, many peoples would have done it many times. As it stands, it seems that people come over the Hindu Kush more in desperation more than anything else. There are some entrepreneurs or some barbarians, later in history. But even when we look at those groups, at the fall of the Mauryan Empire, somewhere in like the 2nd century BCE, there's a sort of, lots of times people call it a dark age between the Mauryan empires and the Gupta empires, which emerged in the 4th century Common Era. A lot of those tribes, or those invaders or conquerors, whatever you want to call them, that make their way over these incredible mountain ranges, they do it because they're being threatened by somebody else. So it's a matter of desperation for them as well. We will see much later that there's some early Islamic tribes, Turkish tribes, that will come into South Asia over the Hindu Kush, specifically to conscript resources and human resources. And that's a different situation. But we'll talk about that later. Right now, getting over this mountain range is no easy task, and so you have to wonder why they did it, what were they looking for, what were their motivations, we can answer some of these questions loosely based on the primary sources we have. In this case, our only real primary source are literary sources. And the oldest of these would be the Vedic texts, the Vedic literature. Veda means ancient sacred knowledge. These were the sacred poems and texts that is sort of some of the focus of this morning. They're still sacred texts for Hindus to this very day, by the way. The Aryans belong to the Indo-European family. Um, this is not necessarily a racial designation at all. This is a linguistic designation. Um, am I saying that there was this multicultural race of Indo-European people who lived between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea and then migrated out? No. But the people from there, they were probably more homogenous. But as they migrated out, they intermixed with other peoples. Okay? And when we look at it, you can't look at physical characteristics to associate the ancient Greeks of the Iliad and the Aryans of the Vedic era, so much as you can look at their linguistic similarities and the stories they tell. So if we look at their writings, their mythologies, then we see the similarity. So the appropriate way of looking at the Indo-European family is through a linguistic inheritance. For example, there are similarities between, and which goes back, into the ancient heritage of English and of Hindi, which is the national language of India. Um, uh, what those are exactly go all the way back to the similarities between probably Greek, some parts of Latin and Greek, um, and some of the Celtic, which all derive from Indo-European, and Sanskrit. And if we look at it at that level, some stuff has come down this long line, this long sort of linguistic family tree into both languages. And I have a few examples uh, coming up. So we all belong to the Indo-European family of languages. Now, if you look at other languages in India, such as Tamil, that's a Dravidian language. It has a different heritage. If you look at languages, say in the Middle East, like Aramaic or Arabic or Hebrew, those have a Semitic origin. They're a different linguistic family tree. Indo-European, though, is this group that the Aryans come from, and we will get the language Sanskrit from them. Okay, what the Aryans bring to South Asia is what a lot of what we call Brahmanical Hinduism. Let me unpack this word for a second. Brahmanical refers to the highest in the socio-religious caste, the upper level, and by the word we use for this, we should be using for this in this Aryan context is Varna, not caste. Caste is a word that the Portuguese used when they first came to India, and they caste in their idea meant translated more like class or even vocation. Varna are four segments of the social hierarchical religious order that are found in the ancient Vedic texts, known as Varna. The top Varna were the priests or the Brahmins. I have diagrams of this for you in this lecture. So Brahmanical means it's this priestly early form of Hinduism. Now let me unpack Hinduism for you. It's a tricky word to deal with because the word first appears, we think of it as a particular religion in India, the dominant, majority of people in India, which is true. But Hinduism is expressed in so many different ways. There are so many different ways of being Hindu. Just as you might look at an evangelical Christian versus a Roman Catholic versus a Mormon. All of them are Christian under a broad definition of, or maybe even a simplistic definition of Christian, but they practice Christianity in very, very different ways. So too in Hinduism, it's even more varied and more vast and complicated. But if you're not a part of that system, it's easy just to lump it all together and say those are Hindus. Many of my Hindu friends in India would look at everybody in the West, Western Europe and America pretty much, and just say, oh, you're Christian. You're either, Jewish or Christian, maybe Muslim. This has changed. But like when I was first traveling to India in the 1990s, this is the late 90s, this is what people are like, oh, you must be Christian. And I'm like, no. Oh, you're Jewish? No. I mean, I guess probably I told some people, yes, I was baptized, as a child, as a Christian, and my family doesn't happen to be Jewish, but, you know, I don't align with any one particular religious tradition. That's confusing too for people. Um, but now it's more understood, right? Anyways, I digress. What about Hinduism? So there's so many different ways of being Hindu, but where does the etymology of the word come from? Well, after the proliferation of Islam, so we're talking early 7th century of the Common Era, Islam takes off like a weed, just vastly and incredibly fast growth and success in spreading their worldview across the Middle East, across North Africa, into Spain, Iberian Peninsula, in Europe, and then all the way across Persia up to the Indus River. So these Arabs get to the Indus River, there's some really brilliant Arab, I would call them early sociologists, who write about the people they encounter up here and write about the people across the river. So we have these fantastic sources from this era, and one particular writer, Al Biruni, is writing about these people, and he talks about caste, and he talks about the priests and their gods and their temples and the ordinary folks and all this sort of stuff. It's great primary source material. But what he refers to is the people on the other side of the Indus River, which he refers to that land as Al-Hind, the land of Hind. Okay? Everybody over there is sort of lumped together, not by this particular Arab scholar, but by everybody who's reading his writing, like, oh, Al-Hind, the land of the Hindus. So Buddhists, Jains, people with, tribal, traditions, and what we would call Hindus today, all of them get lumped together as one sort of thing. And to complicate it even more, Hinduism later absorbs the Buddha as an incarnation of one of their chief deities, Vishnu. So they also absorb Christianity in some cases. They say Jesus is an incarnation of Vishnu. So they encompass so many different things, so it's complicated. But when I talk about Brahmanical Hinduism, I'm talking about a very early form of Hinduism, which is a polytheistic religion that has a very distinct tenets within its religion, but you sort of understand the basics of it, like, reincarnation, and this is based on karma and one's duty to one's dharma, and the ultimate goal is to be released from the cycle of rebirth known as samsara. Most all Hindus believe in that, but how one achieves this is varied, just as I made reference with Christianity. Now, the Brahmanical part of it is, this is a very early Vedic Vedic period where the Brahmins are really in charge. The Brahmins are patronized by the kings, by the merchants, by everybody to ensure blessings from these nature deities, essentially, and a good life. Okay, so it's not Hinduism as we see it today so much, but it's the early footings of Hinduism, really run by the Brahmins. Hinduism much later will take huge diversions, and it'll go through its own quote unquote Protestant Reformation, but where it's more power to the people, based more on texts and less on rituals and the need of these Brahmin priests. But the early nascent forms of this arrive with the Aryans. The Brahmins physically walked over the mountains into India. Okay, here's a map showing this. I hope I'm not confusing you. I hope this is reifying some of what's stated in your textbook. It'll make more sense as we move along. This is one of the challenges of taking a non-Western course. Those of us who have studied it and taught it and research in these areas, this is second nature to us. And when you're new to it, many of the terminologies can be very challenging. But if we can think of this stuff in terms of things we understand, so if you can think of like the Brahmin priestly caste sort of in the same terms of, let's say, a Catholic priest, and how the people have a need for the priest to perform different rituals, whether it be the Eucharist or whatever, in order for them to have access to the boons of the deities or of God, then it might make sense to you if you were raised in a Catholic scenario, right? Anyway, so up here is the posited homeland of these Indo-Europeans. So southern Russia, right? In between the Black Sea, the Caspian Sea, just above the Caucasus Mountains. And these groups migrate all over the place. But this is the root of the Aryan people. I mean, there are other Indo-Europeans who migrate the other direction, but they come through around the Caspian Sea in various ways. Well, the two ways you could come around it, into the Persian plateau, and then they make their way down into India. And, they deposit in different places. What's interesting is some of these older Indo-European languages up around here are slightly different. Sanskrit is slightly different than Pali. They're both Indo-European derivatives. Pali is the Indo-European language that the Buddhist scriptures are preserved in. Sanskrit is super close to Pali, but different tribal groups all sort of locate in different areas. And then we have a group moving down south, further south. What's interesting here, I think, is that one of the languages down here in the island nation of Sri Lanka on the tip of India is known as Sinhalese, and Sinhalese is Indo-European, whereas the northern portion of Sri Lanka and many southern parts of India speak Tamil, which is a different language altogether. It's a Dravidian origin. So these Indo-European influences came in different waves. We often think of it and even write about it in terms of one group coming in. It's one group, but different waves, and their influence penetrates the subcontinent on different timelines. But we can't trace each one of those out in a course such as this. But this is the trajectory. And here's the Hindu Kush, right? So these are this treacherous mountains that not even Genghis Khan dared to come down. I mean, it was like he was supposedly he was returning from the Middle East and was up here heading back up towards Mongolia in the 13th century, and he died along the way. But the Mongols certainly could have come down here, but it was just too much, and they didn't do it. Okay, and here are Brahmin priests in action. They wear the sacred thread. They're the twice born. They're the descendants of the great seers of the knowledge of the ancient, of the creation and all that sort of thing. And they maintain all of the sacrifices and rituals necessary to appease the gods, the pantheon of deities, as well as to the gods then to give the people blessings. So they're the intermediary, right? If you're thinking hunter and gather context, these people function like the shaman would, where the shaman, can intercede. They're a liminal character. They can intercede on behalf of the deities and the transcendent world, as well as the terrestrial and human social world. And so we can see this in any tradition that has priests that intercede on the people's behalf with the gods, and they have some function of ritual. It looks very same. And this tradition, these Brahmins, it's a very old tradition. It's alive and well. If you know many people of Indian descent, you may know some people whose family are of Brahmin descent. Their family historically is from a Varna known as the Brahmins, potentially. Even to this day, most Brahmins, I'm not going to say all of them because the world is changing, but most Brahmins still, even if they don't function as priests, still retain a complete vegetarian, if not vegan, diet. Some of the stuff goes back historically as religious purity, less pollution. Consuming the meat or the milk or whatever of other sentient beings who are on their own spiritual path can damage one's own spiritual development. Thus, you see a lot of vegetarianism. And then nearly all Hindus that I know, not all of them, most Hindus that I know abstain from eating beef. because cattle are considered sacred. Part of that is because these Aryans that come over are they're pastoral nomads. You know, some of the early text writings about them said, "Oh, they're just these hoarding barbarians who have horses and chariots and hafted axes, so they, you know, made of iron, so they um, could dominate anybody through force." But really, their main vocation was as nomadic pastoralists. You know, think Abraham. You know, with his herds. That's what these guys did. They had learned technology, Iron Age technology, as well as they had domesticated horses. So, but it doesn't necessarily mean that was their main vocation. Um, Quite the contrary. So cattle become one of their sources of wealth. They did not abstain from eating cattle, but if we go back to the what we can tell from the images on the artifact seals from the Indus River, they also had some sort of veneration for the bull. So if you bring those two traditions together, it makes sense that subsequent generations of a blending of society over centuries could venerate the cow to an extent that it becomes sacred. And that is, in fact, what happens. So, they're the Brahmins. You can see these Brahmins, they pass it on from, it's a familial sort of thing. So you're born into this Varna. So if your father's a priest and you're the, you know, the oldest male or the, you know, his descendant, you will be trained into the ways of a Brahmin typically.